Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the third and final event of the 2022 Progressive Ideas webinar series. I'm Josie Foss, the Executive Director of the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation. In this series, we get glimpses into the work of the university faculty the foundation has supported throughout the year. And we have the opportunity to learn directly from these experts about the original research they've conducted. Tonight, we're very excited to welcome Professor Elora Raymond. Elora is an urban planner and assistant professor in the School of City and Regional Planning in the College of Design at Georgia Tech. Her research interests focus on the financialization of housing and land ownership, housing justice, displacement within housing systems, race, and segregation. Her previous work on the role and impacts of corporate investors in the residential real estate market has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Economist, and elsewhere. Tonight, she'll share with us the results of her most recent work, which examined the continuation of these trends in a sampling of southern U.S. cities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Raymond, thank you so much for joining us. We can't wait to learn what your research has revealed about this important and timely topic.
Hi, my name is Elora Raymond. I am an assistant professor at the School of City and Regional Planning at Georgia Tech, and my focus is affordable housing. I study financialization, displacement and dispossession through housing systems. So I look a lot at patterns of investment that lead to gentrification, evictions, and following the foreclosure crisis. Did a lot of work on how the recovery from the foreclosure crisis was in and of itself unequal and led to a lot of loss of housing equity. Today, I'm here to talk about collateral and the value of land and speculative investment during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to start out with thinking about this idea of collateral. I think we're pretty familiar with the idea that when you buy something and you maybe use a mortgage to purchase a piece of real estate, you might put up the real estate as collateral, and that's a pretty familiar construct. But I want to spend a little bit more time thinking about the recent history of the ways in which housing has been taken up as collateral, and how that's changed some of the dynamics that we're seeing and how large corporate investors, private equity firms, REITs, the like, are investing in single-family rentals. I'm going to start with these kind of three historical examples, and then we'll talk about the data analysis that we've done in the Southeast during the kind of 2020 through 2021 period. So on the right here, you can see what is probably familiar to you, an HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining map. And I just want to raise a really top line observation about these maps. Usually we understand redlining as this process by which FHA mortgage insurers denied FHA mortgage insurance to borrowers of color and to people living in racially integrated neighborhoods or neighborhoods that were predominantly people of color. And that was really a racist process embedded in our mortgage financial systems that led to segregation and to a denial of homeownership to people of color. And recently, a colleague, Todd Mitchney, did some fascinating research, looking at primary documents by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. What he uncovered is that, first of all, the redlining maps that we associate with FHA, typically HOLC maps that were produced during the 1930s as part of this recovery from the Great Depression. And also what he finds is that these were the first maps to really think about not whether or not a mortgage should be originated or whether somebody should be extended, upon application, mortgage insurance, but actually these were used after the fact to assess the value of the collateral for existing HOLC loans. So what Mitchney describes is that these officers acquired paper lists of mortgages that were, at the time, organized alphabetically by borrower name, and they painstakingly translated this, incorporating both these lists and also interviews with lots of realtors and other, experts in each city that they covered. They would painstakingly translate all of these individual debts into these hand-shaded, color-coded maps of racialized neighborhood level risk. And this was done after the loans had been originated. This was done really to assess the collateral risk and value. To think about disposition strategies for HOLC. So they started this process, in the late, in like 1936, which is after 99% of their loans had been originated. So recasting these mortgages around collateral value allowed a more speculative and racialized element into these kind of secondary mortgage market institutions. So Michny notes that loans in redlined areas and loans to Black borrowers, because many redlined areas weren't necessarily all Black borrowers in those areas, they didn't perform worse than other areas or other borrowers. In fact, Black borrowers in particular had an extremely good repayment record. But when these institutions reorganized loan servicing and valuation around collateral value and around neighborhoods rather than individuals, they were allowed to kind of inject more of these speculative ideas. So the next instance that I want to talk about is something that is, again, deep in the weeds of mortgage finance in the 2000s. It's called the Mortgage Electronic Registration System. And again, I want to think about how the value of collateral is being propped up by our institutions. And also think about what does it mean? What are the attributes of collateralized housing that we can see during these episodes of change? So since HOLC's invention of redlining maps, we still see our property institutions continue to evolve. And the lead up to the foreclosure crisis, one thing that we saw happen was that our financial systems and our legal systems shifted to facilitate increasing collateralization of housing. So prior to the 2000s, mortgages were pretty rarely transferred, right? If your bank originated a mortgage, a lot of the time they'd hold it in portfolio. Maybe they'd securitize it, with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but there wasn't this constant buying and selling and trading. I don't know if you've gotten those letters in the mail saying, hey, you have a new mortgage service, or somebody else has purchased your mortgage, but it's pretty frequent nowadays. But prior to 2000s, mortgages were rarely transferred, and they were rarely separated from the note. So the mortgage is a document that attaches the debt that's defined by the note, attaches the debt to the collateral and combines those two things. They're separate, but they're really thought of as being very, very much joined. And so after the 2000s, as we see the rise of private label securitizations, we see that the pace of mortgage transfers rises exponentially with the rise of the private securitization industry. And in the early 2000s, in response to just the sheer volume of mortgage transactions and what is now a $17.6 trillion market, mortgage securitizers changed how mortgages were registered and assigned. And so what they did was, and you can see in the image here, a sort of flow chart of how this all works. They created the Mortgage Electronic Registration System. This system left the buying and selling of homes intact, but shifted the legal process for buying and selling rights to the collateral, if that makes sense. So the process for buying your house would be the same, depending on which county you live in. You'd still have to follow, kind of your state's laws for making sure that property transfer was registered. What the Mortgage Electronic Registration System did was really change the way rights to your house as collateral were transferred as mortgages were bought and sold. So these firms abandoned Section 3 of the Uniform Commercial Code, which prioritized clarity of title and public registration of transactions and mortgage assignments. And they shifted these transactions to Section 9, which is the portion of the UCC that concerns contract law. And so these financial institutions kind of left the title and registration systems for real property intact, but pressed for reform of the titling systems for collateral, which is what we might call this system. And what happens is that once a mortgage is assigned to the MERS system, securities linked to that collateral can be bought and sold without ever paying millions of dollars in filing fees to county deed registers. And the proprietary MERS database serves as the only registration of the party that holds a beneficial interest to the mortgage. So what does this mean? In one sense, you can see this construct in which the collateral is being bought and sold many times, or the rights of the collateral is being bought and sold many times, but the collateral itself in the primary housing market never changes hands. And I think that's going to be important later on when we think about what's going on in the current day. And the other thing that's happening is that, through what you might argue is increasing financialization, it's becoming harder and harder for somebody who lives in a house to understand who owns the house, because the complexity of the financial systems behind them is getting just more and more complicated. And the paperwork is moving out of these public systems for registry and titling that are ideally supposed to be fairly transparent and clear, not clear, but publicly available. And they're moving into private systems that are opaque and proprietary. So those are two characteristics I think that we can see in this episode. So then I want to move on and talk about single-family rental securitization, which is really close to the whole purpose of this research, which is to look into the buying and selling of single-family homes for rent by large corporate investors during the pandemic. So, and this is another episode, I think, of institutional change or innovation within our financial systems. So in the aftermath of the foreclosure crisis, institutional investors, private equity firms, and other large corporate investors continued to trade in collateralized debt backed by housing. And this time the vehicle, instead of being owner-occupied housing, which is what I was talking about in the last example, this time the vehicle was single-family rentals. And the rise of single-family rentals as a business that large corporate investors and private equity firms and REITs are very much invested in, that's very much tied to the invention of single-family rental securitization structures. While single-family homes have long been commodified, and there's always been a substantial portion of our rental market in single-family rentals, the securitization structures allowed large corporate firms to position these homes as collateral for the first time. And so that's, I think, one of the key things that's different between 2010 and today. That means that we have a new juggernaut in the housing market. So to me, it's instructive to look at the creation of these sort of investment vehicles to think about how they could have been and how they were actually structured. And that's a little bit revealing to understand that development process. So the first single-family rental securitization was designed by Deutsche Bank in collaboration with Blackstone's Invitation Homes. The process for innovating the structure was slow, and it started out with these pilots or joint ventures by Fannie Mae, and then Fannie Mae and the private and the public sector and the quasi-governmental sector worked together through a series of trial designs until they ended up with the final structure. And so early attempts at this did not secure a AAA rating as an entity which securitized the rental payment stream. And what that means is that the credit rating agencies just weren't willing to say that these investment vehicles were extremely low risk when they were just evaluating on the basis of their net operating income and the amount of revenue they could bring in relative to costs. So what ended up happening is that instead of structuring single-family rental securitizations like other commercial mortgage-backed securities, that was rejected. Instead, what Deutsche Bank did was they over-collateralized the investment. And so they relied on the value of the homes themselves to secure the AAA credit rating. In essence, what they were saying to investors was, hey, we don't know if the rents can cover the interest rate on these investments, but we assure you that the resale value of the homes, once you foreclose on them, that is the collateral, is going to make sure that you're fully repaid for any investment you make and that you needn't worry about default because of this collateral value. So what we see from this instance is that collateral anchors these deep and liquid markets where secured investments are resold, and the value of that collateral kind of relies on digital systems, appraisals, and prices in secondary financial markets to retain their value. And one thing I might note about that is, like, while we often talk about the commodification of housing, commodities are typically characterized as being fungible, frequently sold objects. But what we're seeing in each of these examples, and what I think is happening here, is that collateral doesn't need to transact. So you don't need to be able to buy low and sell high to make money off of an asset that is being used as collateral. What you can do is make profits off of the buying and selling of the debt. So just as mortgages are assigned to the MERS system and they stay there, and the debt attached to them is buying and selling, but MERS is the single owner in the primary market, right? That doesn't change. So what we see is that financial assets collateralized by these mortgages transact, but the collateral itself does not need to transact. And in fact, some of the transactions in the underlying asset are costly to the business of making profits in the secondary market. So a couple of overall thoughts about these three episodes are: number one, when the Homeowners Loan Corporation kind of introduced this idea of creating neighborhood maps of value that were related to demographics, it was deeply racialized. And it also introduced this kind of speculative character that made the actual individual loan performance a little bit more indirectly related to the value of the collateral, and made more abstract valuations more important. With the MERS electronic registration system, we see that as the ability of firms to enhance the value, or the ease with which they use homes as collateral, we get a lot of opaqueness in the primary market. So homeowners are no longer really able to see who currently holds their mortgage. And we also see that a lot of profit is made in the secondary market without anything happening necessarily in the primary market. And then in the kind of 2010s, which I think is the beginning of the current moment that we're in with regard to single family rentals, we see that really it was very important for these firms to not base their borrowing on the value of the rents that they were accruing, but instead to base them on collateral. So those are the three things that I draw by looking at kind of these historical examples. So then I want to talk a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic housing crisis. Initially, when we talked with Schalkenbach about Foundation about doing this work, we thought that there might be a lot of foreclosures and distressed properties. And we thought that because, as we saw in 2020 and 2021, there was widespread unemployment, service sectors like transportation, retail, hospitality, lines of business with which often have high employees who tend to rent homes, they were affected with unemployment most severely. But we didn't see a lot of foreclosures for a couple of reasons. One is that there was a pretty strong mortgage forbearance policy. So while we saw a lot of loans become delinquent, we didn't see them move into foreclosure. And because home prices didn't fall, when a homeowner did decide to exit, or to sell their house, they were able to sell it without going into foreclosure. So, a precursor to a foreclosure crisis is falling prices, right? You can have a lot of people, unable to pay their mortgage and maybe becoming delinquent. But if prices aren't falling and there's still buyers, then you don't have foreclosures climbing. And at the same time, sort of at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw that private equity and large corporate single-family rental investors were poised to invest in the downturn. They just amassed massive war chests, and I think they were calling them that as well, with which to invest in what they saw was going to be a downturn. And it was surprising to me that we didn't see prices fall at all. We actually saw them rise, but it makes sense when you think about that last point. And we'll talk a little bit about what we did find. So we examined housing transactions from 2019 through September 2021 in Metro Atlanta, Miami, and Tampa. We looked at the volume of purchases, median prices, and location, and we hand-coded large corporate investors and classified the firms by type. So we looked at single family rental, rent to own, iBuyers, and trading platforms. And we initially did this with master's students kind of going through and identifying the purchases that could be tied to large corporations and researching each one. And we're going to try and use a machine learning technique. It's really difficult actually to figure out, looking through all the different LLCs and shell companies, who owns what when it comes to real estate. And that's one of the problems that we'll talk about and policy recommendations that we'll link to in the end. So these are some of the firms that we found being really active in our study areas. Open Door and Zillow, OfferPad, and HomeVestors, which is sort of a franchise operation. So they do, each of their franchisees seems to do slightly different stuff. A lot of what they seem to be doing was operating as trading platforms where they're, in a sense, replacing realtors and doing automated buying and selling of homes in the owner-occupied housing market. We found Divvy Homes, the rent-to-own firm, was really active at this time. So they buy homes and then they use a rent-to-own scheme, which has this kind of problematic history. And then we found a lot of institutional single-family rental firms like Freddie & Partners, Sylvan Road, American Homes for Rent, et cetera. So at this point, what we wanted to understand was, where are these firms investing? Are they investing in ways that are going to create problems with inequities? Are they investing in places where COVID hit the hardest? What kind of patterns are we seeing? So what we found was that by summer of 2021, these large corporate buyers were buying twice as many homes per quarter as in 2019. So you can see here that by the summer of 2021, they're buying about 2,000 homes a quarter. And prior to that, for all of 2019, they'd been buying about 1,000 a quarter. And what's really interesting to me is that, after the Great Recession, these large corporate buyers are really reliant on the low prices of foreclosed homes. But even though there were many distressed owners that were having trouble paying mortgages during the COVID pandemic, there wasn't a similar spike in foreclosed homes. And so these firms have transitioned from being distressed property investors to being market price investors, and actually outcompeting, in many examples, people in the owner-occupied housing market. So here's an example of what was going on in Atlanta. So these are from DeKalb and Gwinnett County in Atlanta, which are core counties in the metro area. And so what we see is, on the left, the number of purchases is just steeply increasing in both of these counties. And we also see that median sales prices are rising at a pretty fast clip. So here's just a subset of just DeKalb and Gwinnett. And what we find is that the number of homes that are being purchased rises to about 1,400 a quarter for Gwinnett County and 600 a quarter for DeKalb. And prices are also increasing really swiftly. And so by summer of 2021, these large corporate landlords are increasing their purchases until they comprise 53% of single family rental purchases and 17% of all single family sales. And prices at the same time rose by 78% in DeKalb County, from around 130,000 to 240,000. Prices rose around 50% in Gwinnett County, from around 190K to around 290K. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the suburbs, the kind of inner suburbs of Atlanta, but these are places where typically you could buy a house for $130,000. So it's really surprising to see this pace of investment and these kinds of price increases in these normally affordable, low income to moderate income homeownership communities. So overall, we found that a lot of this activity was concentrated in Atlanta, and there weren't as many drastic changes in Florida. And we also break down the price increases by type of firm. So in this chart, you can see that around, for the single family rental firms, prices were increasing by 28% every single quarter. For the rent-to-own firms, prices were increasing by still a really fast 18%. And for the trading partners and for owner-occupied, so just households who are buying houses, their prices were increasing by 9% per quarter. So this doesn't control for composition. These are just descriptives. This isn't like a causal model or anything like that. But when you see firms taking up this much of the market and prices rising so swiftly, just among the prices that they're willing to pay, it does suggest that they're outbidding for the same homes. They're outbidding kind of normal households who are trying to buy. And so I think a study that controls for composition could find just that. But I just want to be clear that we're not quite doing that yet. In all three cities, the single family rental and rent to own firms purchase in predominantly Black and non-white Hispanic neighborhoods. So, the median demographic composition of the neighborhood where they buy is 84% non-white. It's typically predominantly owner-occupied, so 33 to 38% renter, and the remainder is owner-occupied. And for these areas, relatively low poverty rate. So one interpretation of that is that these firms are taking houses off the market for middle-income people of color in traditionally affordable cities like Atlanta, Tampa, places like that. And the last thing we analyzed was kind of the location choice of these firms and whether it changed during the pandemic. And so we do find that these firms are purchasing, particularly the rent-to-own and the single-family rental firms, not the trading platforms, are increasing the number of purchases in places that have a high COVID-19 impact index, that have a higher equity index, meaning these are places where people of color and people of lower income live, and increasing their purchases in places that have a higher housing instability index. So what can we draw from all of this? First of all, I think it's notable that the foreclosure prevention policy during the pandemic, unlike the eviction prevention policy, the foreclosure prevention was very effective. But that also meant that these firms demonstrated the degree to which they're no longer distressed property investors. They're no longer buying homes at auction after foreclosure for fire sale prices. They're really competing with and out-competing homeowners for single-family homes. We see that these investors increased their purchases during the pandemic, and they increased their prices dramatically, by 28% per quarter for the single-family rental firms and 18% per quarter by the rent-to-own firm. These investors are really focused in non-white communities and in the Southeast. So the median demographic composition of the neighborhood where they buy is 84%, 84% non-white, and they invested in areas hit hard by COVID-19 to some degree. So to me, this kind of begs the question that I tried to frame early on, trying to understand, when single-family rental firms first emerged after the foreclosure crisis, the thinking was that they would buy low and sell high, and that they would make their profits off of price appreciation. And what I think we're seeing here is that these firms, unlike many other types of investors, when we look at typologies of how, what's the profit strategy for a given type, investor type in real estate, sometimes people are flippers, sometimes they're really banking on, increasing the rent, sometimes they're really banking on this speculative strategy of being able to buy low and sell high. And I think what we need to think about more deeply is the role of these homes as collateral, where these firms are able to buy them and then borrow against them through various conduits, then expand their purchases and buy more. And just like with MERS, the collateral doesn't need to change hands. These firms can realize profits through their dealings in secondary markets. And the other thing I'd say is that prices are less directly anchored in rents and resale values. So do we see consistent rental increases? Absolutely. Do we see these firms increasing their revenue by using hidden fees and retaining more of their security deposits? Absolutely. But because of maybe their market strategy, I think that the prices they're willing to pay for home is less directly anchored to the rents they can charge. And then finally, because these firms are able to profit from downturns and upswings, so they amass this big, investment capacity at the beginning of the pandemic, expecting distressed properties. They didn't find that, but they were still able to profit off of a market in which prices were rising. It suggests to me that these firms are not going away. They're not going to reduce their position in single family rentals. And that, I think, is something that policymakers really need to take into consideration. So I have a couple of thoughts about policy. As an urban planner, I try and be policy relevant. And so one thing I say is that these large corporate landlords, and I've shown this in other research that I've done, they have an established history of exceedingly high eviction rates. We looked at them here in Atlanta. We found that some of these firms were filing for eviction against a third of all their tenants in a given year. And they were just substantially more likely to file for eviction against their tenants than other types of firms operating in the same neighborhoods. They've been associated with poor maintenance and aggressive rental increases. And so there's a need to strengthen tenant protections as we see these firms purchasing more aggressively in rental housing. I think we need a better analysis of market power and the potential for, antitrust. And for that, we really need rental registries and transparency about ownership. It's really hard to reconstruct what the market share of Invitation Homes is, even in one county in the country. It takes a lot of manpower and combing through records and combining data sets. And particularly because of the layered investment patterns, these are all going to be conservative estimates because there's no way to truly know who the beneficial owner is of some of the LLCs that we find in our tax assessors databases and in our deeds databases. So we need a rental registry, ideally nationwide. Municipal level is great, and a lot of cities around the country have that, so that we can have transparency about ownership. And this is related to the ability of cities and tenants to be able to communicate with their landlord around issues. But also we need to understand market power. So often you'll hear large corporate investors say, oh, we own 2 to 3% of single family rentals nationwide. Absolutely. At least within the past 5 years, that's absolutely true. Nationwide is not a meaningful market definition for rental housing. Rental housing has a localized market, and it's also you need to think about housing type, right? So your typical tenant is not looking for either a studio or a 4-bedroom. Either they're in a 5-person household and they need the 5-bedroom, or they're, somebody who doesn't need 5 bedrooms and 4 bedrooms, and they're really looking for a studio or a 1-bedroom. So, in order to understand market share, we need to be able to know what the market share is within a given submarket, and that's geographically defined and defined by housing type. We're in a situation, I think, where because homeowners don't have access to the same types of debt and to debt at the same price, they can't compete. I think it's important to stop the public subsidy of single-family rental securitizations through the GSEs and through other mechanisms. And I also wonder whether, the recent Fed action to raise rates was in part intended to cool the housing market. Is this really going to impact these firms to the same degree that it impacts homeowners? I don't think so. I think that market rates, are all tethered to the rates the Fed set, but they don't all move by the same amount. And so I wonder whether we need to think about homeowners' ability to compete in their, the price of debt with these firms. And then this is a little abstract, but I think we should think about interventions that reduce the speculative appraisals of collateral and restore a more direct tie to what I'm going to call the real economy of what tenants can pay and what people who are earning a waged income or salaried income can pay for housing. Because, after all, housing is a basic need. It's like, up there with food, water, air. It's a basic need for shelter that we need to fill every day. And, having one of those basic needs be out of reach for people or, rising in prices substantially is really problematic. So thanks very much for listening to this talk. I'm really looking forward to your questions. And that's it.
Elora, thank you so much for that sort of disturbing but very informative presentation. To everybody who's on and watching, if you'd like to put questions in the Q&A area, I will be reading them out for Elora to respond to. I could probably fill the whole rest of our time with my questions, but I'm not going to do that. But I do want to start out with one, because I was just at the American Planning Association conference in San Diego a couple months ago, and went to some panels about gentrification. And I have to say, they kind of sounded a lot like they always do, with, oh, there's, wealthy white people who are moving into areas and they're driving up prices and they're pricing out long-term, residents, and what can we do about it? And I didn't hear, at least in those conversations, really this narrative thread at all. And it seems as if your research is really pointing to this being a significant driver of folks being placed out or, priced out of areas where they could previously live comfortably. Do you feel like, did I just maybe hit some bad sessions that weren't sort of onto this yet? Do you feel like this is something that planners can do anything about?
I think, yeah, so I wrote a paper on gentrification and speculative investment. And I feel like there's a lot of people who think of gentrification as this process that's kind of this slow demographic transition where, one family moves out and then the bodega has one less customer, and then, it's less profitable for them, and and over 15 years, you get neighborhood change through demographic social processes. And there's another school of thought that really talks about real estate as being a huge driver of these processes. And 15 years before you can start to measure that neighborhood demographic change, investors and developers are already saying, and planners are already saying, this neighborhood is ripe for a change. And in the study, we look at which type of investors have that kind of profit model in their heads. And it's firms that are more tightly connecting their properties to global financial markets through securitization and other investment strategies. And we found that when these firms bought an apartment building in a neighborhood, not only did we see a spike in evictions in the following year, which didn't happen with other types of investors, but we also saw over 6 years stark, much higher rates of neighborhood change than in the adjacent neighborhoods where an investor of that type hadn't done that. So I really push the gentrification folks. It's great, but if you're using census data to understand gentrification, you've already missed the boat. You're looking at a process that began 15 years ago, and by the time the census measures it and people have started noticeably changing the composition of the neighborhood, early speculators have already made their money and moved on. And so we need to look at real estate data sets and look at, tax assessors data sets, eviction records, real-time data, and focusing on that real estate process. Sorry, that's a very long-winded answer to your question.
No, that's exactly what I was wondering. It was the one panel I'm thinking of in particular was very well attended. And so the line to ask questions was hugely long, and I didn't get into it to ask, hey, have you taken this into account? Because I knew, obviously, being familiar with your work, nobody else asked about it either. So it just felt like, I think we're missing an important factor here. So I'm going to start with other people's questions. Have the communities responded in any significant way by channeling funds into the construction of permanently affordable housing?
So thanks so much for that question, Edward. I want to say that, we focused on just 2 counties, in 3 different cities. But this is a nationwide phenomenon. And so when you say these communities, I instantly think which communities, because from California to North Carolina and everywhere in between, these firms bought really high percentages of single family homes over the last year. I think the National Association of Realtors did analysis and found that they bought 28% of all single family homes in the state of Texas. So different communities have responded in different ways. Some communities have done very little, others have done quite a lot in terms of constructing permanently affordable housing. And I think one of the challenges is, are you building new housing and putting it into that same marketplace in which these guys are bigger, stronger, faster, better funded? and can outcompete homeowners, or are you creating housing that will stay permanently affordable, either because it's likely because of its ownership? You know, if it's a community land trust, if it has some kind of restriction on resale, I think that makes it permanently affordable.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking land trust as you were talking and wondering how they fit into the equation. Do you see them as offering a respite?
I think they're great, and I think the challenge, and you really need a community land trust expert, is always getting it to scale. And so just getting the number of units that we need, which is substantial. We haven't been building enough housing for 10 years now. And so we can't make it up with, 10 here and 12 there. We need a lot of units. So that's really the challenge. Yeah.
Another question. So does this not suggest that the entire edifice of financialization, layer by layer, is grounded in the real productive value of the land? That's a very Georgist question.
So I don't know what you mean by real productive value of the land. I apologize. But everything else I agree with. And if I can bracket the real productive value of the land, I would say there's financialization of things other than housing and land, right? We see financialization in higher ed. That's hard to, well, you could argue that universities own a lot of real estate, but let's not go there. So I think financialization has really transformed the relationship of land and valuation of land, and that we can't, and I see this with policymakers, they're very focused on, well, we need to build more homes and we need to support the people who buy the homes. And they're totally ignoring this market that's right behind the real tangible market of finance. And you have to pay attention to what's going on in the secondary market, because it really is impacting that primary market of people building and selling homes and people making money and buying them.
You recently testified before Congress, right, about this research?
Yeah.
What were they asking you about? How were they? It sounds like you sort of hinted at that just now, but is your sense that they're going to do something helpful to combat this or to offer people some relief?
I think they're very concerned. I've been contacted multiple times over the past year and a half by different entities in the federal government. I testified twice before Congress for two different, one for a subcommittee and one for a full committee. So I think they're very concerned. It's hard for me to read the tea leaves and know what's going to make it through. But I think, they're going to work on this problem. So.
Okay, another question. Are they betting on people losing their homes? Should MBS for single family homes be made illegal? I think this talk was just amazing. I'm going to look into your research.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that question. So the single family rental business is a rental business. These firms are buying single family homes and offering them for rent. They are associated, these large corporate landlords are associated with very high eviction records. So in that sense, people are losing their homes. And also they are associated with reduced homeownership. So you see where they buy, the homeownership rate is lower. And that's been true at different points over the last 10, 12 years that these firms have been operating. So there's a concern that people are losing their homes, either because they're being kicked out because they're tenants, or because there's just fewer opportunities for homeownership, which we know is a great pathway for household wealth.
Absolutely. We did get a couple questions in that didn't come in through the chat, so I'll read one of those. Is it your sense that these corporate landlords make improvements, cosmetic or flip level, which might play into the pricing of the rentals and possible resales?
They do have maintenance crews. They do put, a certain amount of money into every home they buy. Is it on par with the type of price increases we've seen? I want to say what is more concerning to me is that homeowners put money into, we renovate kitchens, we redo bathrooms, we fix HVACs that are broken, we cut down trees that are covered in ivy. They're able to pay more. So one study that I saw, which was a consultancy, they showed that the amount that investors were willing to pay relative to homeowners used to be like 30% less. So like an average homeowner would offer $100,000 for a home, investor would come in around 70K. And that gap has closed over time until in 2019, right before the pandemic, was just like a couple of percent. And this was all investors, like mom and pops and the big, the big firms. If we see these firms are just now able to make more money when they renovate or not, we're going to see declining home ownership. And when you see that these firms bought, 28% of all homes in Texas last year, again, very, very concerning. Given how important, and I didn't say this in the talk, housing wealth represents about half of all the median family's wealth. It's very big money. It's a much bigger component of American wealth than like the stock market, which is kind of the big symbol. So when we start to see home ownership eroded, there's going to be generational consequences, because this is people's retirement fund. People downsize and live off their home equity. This is what people tap into when they get sick. You can borrow against the value of your home if you need to cover healthcare bills or compensate for a lost job. And this is what people use to put their kids through college. So if you see declining homeownership, particularly in Black and Brown communities, but also in white communities, that is going to really impact the financial well-being of people.
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah. Another question. Professor Raymond commented that during COVID, foreclosure prevention was more effective than eviction prevention. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so there was mortgage forbearance in that you were able to very easily say, hey, I can't pay my mortgage right now, and not pay your mortgage for a certain amount of time. I'm not going to say a time frame because I don't remember the exact amount. And then what they did was they said, all right, when you come back into repayment, you don't owe us $30,000 of missed mortgage payments. We're just going to make your mortgage 2 years longer. And that's really easy. That's like super convenient for a household to manage. You can just say, wow, instead of being paid off in 2050, it's going to be 2052. And you don't go through foreclosure. And that worked really well for a lot of people. And I forget exactly how it kicked in, what the application process was, but again, much easier. For eviction prevention, that was not true. Rent debt was due when the moratoria ended. And if you missed, 6 months of rent payments because you were out of work or sick for 6 months, that could be $15,000. Come up with it. So a lot of people ended up getting evicted sooner, later rather than sooner. What else? Very few people knew about eviction moratoria. A lot of times your landlord could go all the way through the process. So they'd file for eviction, you'd lose in court, and then they just stay at the very end. Well, most people don't stick around through that process. So once you get an eviction notice, you start to think about moving or doubling up, stuff like that. So a lot of different ways that the mortgage forbearance worked better for homeowners, which is amazing. After watching the foreclosure crisis, I'm so grateful that we didn't also have a foreclosure crisis, but we could have done much more for renters during this crisis. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I think there's a sort of a clarifying question on one that was asked before. It says, I guess what I want clarity on is, are the corporations making money on rent, or is it something else possibly that's weird, but such as people working minimum wage, their salaries aren't making people wealthy. So is it the rent where they're making money? Possibly that's obvious, but just in case I'm wrong.
You really get to the heart of the matter with that question. Actually, it's a great question. And that's what I'm trying to talk about. I think that these firms are not just making money off the rent. They are making money off the rent, but also they have, here's one scenario, right? Pretend you're a firm and you bought 5 homes for $50,000 during the foreclosure crisis. Then you come back 10, 15 years later you buy 2 more homes for $250,000, right? All of a sudden, the collateral value of all your homes, they all appraise at a much higher value. They're worth more. And now you can go to the bank. What did I say? It was 5 and then 2, and say, hey, I own 7 homes that are all worth $250,000. Can I borrow against them? And the bank will say, sure. And you have all of this cash at a very low interest rate because you're a big firm. And also because you've got collateralized debt. Banks love that. They love to lend when they know they can foreclose on something if they don't get paid. It makes them feel very safe and secure, and they offer you a very low interest rate. So it's not just the rent that these firms are making money off of. These homes are valuable because they're collateral. And the more they're worth, the more they can borrow. And they don't have to sell them ever in order to access the funds that they've sunk into them. So that changes how they operate. It changes the impacts on neighborhoods. And it's very different than if they were kind of like what we're more familiar with, which is a landlord who just makes money off rent, or a flipper who buys a house, fixes it, sells it. These are different firms. They're different. So great question. Thank you.
Are we complicit in this if we're in the stock market? Like if I'm, I have a retirement fund, and a sort of retirement dated to when I'll be whatever age, 65, 90, I can't remember what I put in, but am I, without sort of being aware of it, participating in this?
Yeah. A lot of, pension funds and retirement funds are invested in these businesses. And there's this weird situation where you think of somebody like particularly state employees who have, state retirement funds or state pensions that are invested in these firms. So they're very profitable. So why wouldn't you if you're a pension fund manager? So you're living in a single family rental, you're dealing with higher eviction rates, with hidden fees, with rents that increase every year. You've got unstable housing, it's way too expensive, maintenance is slow, all the things we've learned about these firms. And then you're paying into an investment fund that's actually giving them the finance to be able to do this. Wouldn't it be more streamlined if we just cut out all the middlemen and you were able to buy a house and live in it much more cheaply? So that's kind of like a great thought experiment.
That is also the answer I was hoping you were not going to give, but suspected you would. Wow. Okay. Another question. What is happening to the inventory of city-owned land as the problem of homelessness becomes more evident? Are they coming into foreclosure sales? I mean, are they at that point, or are they sort of staying in the regular housing market right now?
So you mean like in terms of yeah. I mean, I still see the city of Atlanta, selling land to developers. I really think it's a bad idea given what's happened with land prices in this era. I think that 99-year lease is a great idea for publicly owned land, but we really shouldn't be selling public land. Maybe sell it to a community land trust for something that's permanently affordable, even if it is privately managed. But we're selling it. And we're not using it to the extent that we could to deal with homelessness. I see far more efforts around the country to criminalize homelessness than I do to build the housing that people need, even though research shows that, housing first approach is a much better solution for homelessness. If you give people a home, they're able to do all the other things they need to take care of themselves. It's really hard to get a job, stay in treatment, be a good family member when you don't have a home. So that's my thought.
So is that sort of act of keeping land in, if not public hands, then in the hands of an organization designed to steward it for affordability, is that perhaps one of the most effective tools that a local government might have to combat this trend?
I think so. Yeah, I think there's too many people at the local governance level who have a lot of faith in the market for land to provide. And I'm a big fan of markets when it doesn't come to basic needs, right? I don't like a market for my water. I don't like a market for my electricity. And I don't like, a market for housing that doesn't provide for all. If we're seeing that the market is creating all of this cost burden and lack of affordability and disruption to school systems and homelessness, we need to have decommodified, state-owned or mission organization-owned sources of housing, because it is a basic need. And I love having a market for art or yogurt or things that aren't basic needs. All for that.
So just one more question, because we're coming up on 8 o'clock, and this one isn't in the chat, so I'll just read it. To the extent that eviction prevention was effective and tenants were falling behind on rent payments, would you expect individual owners of rental property who might be dependent on that rental income to sell their properties to corporate investors who are not liquidity constrained? Do you have any estimates of the size of that effect?
So we looked for the sale of multifamily and garden style apartments, and it was just dwarfed by the numbers that we saw with single family rentals. I've heard, I haven't read any recent research on it. I would think that is what happened. In part because a lot of landlords also got mortgage forbearance. That might not have happened as much. But I think more research is needed.
Okay. All right. Well, Professor Raymond, thank you so much for doing this event with us and, for allowing us to support this research. This has been eye-opening, horrifying, all at once. I think it ties in, you did touch on a bit in your presentation, LLCs. We're doing some research right now around the role of LLCs in New York City, specifically how they can contribute to, sort of vacancy and driving up home prices. But now I'm sort of thinking, like, is there another angle, not to necessarily duplicate what you've been doing, but to kind of incorporate this knowledge into that research design. So this has been a really, I think, very eye-opening presentation, and really looking forward to, what you're doing next. And hopefully Congress will continue to call on you, because it sounds like you have some really practical and humane solutions to something that is really affecting a basic human need for folks.
Well, I want to thank you so much. It's been wonderful to work with you over the past year, and it's been a great opportunity to just be a little bit more experimental, with kind of conceptualizing, which I think has been really fruitful. So I very much appreciate this opportunity, and thank you all for your questions too. They were really, really fantastic.
All right, everyone, have a wonderful night.